Imagine being born into a life where your every choice, your marriage, your freedom, your future is not your own, where your family, your religion, and even your destiny are decided by strangers, strangers with power, influence, and an unyielding grip on society. For medieval noblewomen, this was not imagination, it was reality, and it was enforced by the church. A teenage girl could be promised to a man she had never met, bound by vows she never agreed to, her entire life orchestrated to serve political alliances and wealth. She was trapped in a gilded cage, a cage sanctioned by God and society alike. But why did the church go to such extreme lengths to control these marriages? What was at stake that justified stripping young women of their freedom and autonomy? And perhaps most shocking of all, what were the human consequences of this control? In the next 45 minutes, we'll uncover the dark, secret strategies the medieval church used to manipulate noble families, the shocking stories of young women whose lives were controlled like pieces on a chessboard, and the consequences that rippled across kingdoms, some of which you won't believe actually happened. In medieval Europe, society was built on a rigid hierarchy where power, wealth, and influence were concentrated in the hands of a few. At the very top sat the nobility, a class whose fortunes and authority were measured not only in land, but in bloodlines and alliances. Within this world, noble women occupied a unique, paradoxical position. They were immensely valuable, yet remarkably powerless. Their lives, their marriages, and even their futures were dictated by forces far beyond their control, and their worth was often defined by the strategic advantages they could provide to their families and to the church. Noble women were born into an intricate web of expectations and obligations. Their lineage, the family into which they were born, was a primary determinant of their life's trajectory. Unlike the sons of nobility, who could inherit lands, titles, and positions of authority, daughters were often considered vessels through which political and economic alliances could be secured. In many cases, a young girl's marriage was negotiated even before she could walk, talk, or comprehend the magnitude of what awaited her. She was a pawn, a living instrument to strengthen family ties, forge alliances, and consolidate power. Her personal desires, ambitions, and feelings were secondary, often irrelevant to the grand designs of her family and society. Take, for example, the powerful House of Plantagenet in England. In this family, as with many others across Europe, marriages were carefully orchestrated to maintain or expand influence. A daughter could be promised to a distant cousin, a rival lord, or even a foreign prince, depending on which union would yield the greatest advantage. These arrangements were not mere suggestions, they were binding agreements that carried enormous political weight. A noblewoman's role was clear. She was the bridge that connected dynasties, the lifeline through which power flowed from one family to another. Yet, beneath this elevated position lay a reality of restricted freedom. Even as she lived amidst opulence, her autonomy was severely limited. Inheritance was another critical factor that elevated the stakes of noble women's marriages. In cases where no male heir existed, daughters became heiresses to vast estates, titles, and properties. These women were immensely valuable, not because of their abilities, intelligence, or personal qualities, but because of the wealth and influence that would transfer through them to their husbands and eventually to their children. Consider Margaret of Anjou, who would later become Queen Consort of England. Her marriage was orchestrated as part of a political strategy to secure alliances and strengthen claims to the throne. Margaret's personal inclinations were secondary to the ambitions of her family and the political machinations of the realm. She was a prize and a weapon, and her compliance was expected. Property, too, played a decisive role in determining a noblewoman's worth. Land ownership equated to wealth, power, and influence. By controlling who a noblewoman married, families could direct the flow of these resources. Estates, castles, and strategic territories were often part of marriage agreements, making daughters indispensable assets in the ongoing games of politics. This transactional nature of marriage meant that a young woman's personal happiness was frequently sacrificed on the altar of family strategy. The church, which claimed moral and spiritual authority over all, often reinforced these arrangements, providing religious justification for what were essentially political transactions. The significance of noble women in medieval politics cannot be overstated. They were the connectors, the glue holding intricate networks of alliances together. Their marriages could end feuds, unite warring families, or secure peace treaties. In some cases, the political fate of entire regions rested on the unions of these women. The House of Valois in France, for example, strategically married daughters into various noble families to consolidate power and expand influence across the kingdom. Each marriage was meticulously calculated to produce political advantage, leaving little room for the consideration of personal choice or affection. While noble women were central to the strategic machinations of their families and the church, this centrality came at a significant personal cost. Their lives were dictated by an expectation of obedience and compliance. Refusal to marry as arranged could bring shame, disgrace, or even punishment. The church often acted as the enforcer of these arrangements, invoking religious doctrine and moral authority to ensure compliance. Through its influence, the church effectively legitimized the use of women as political instruments. A noblewoman who resisted could be accused of sin, disobedience, or even heresy, putting not only herself but her family at risk of social and spiritual condemnation. To illustrate, consider the story of Blanche of Castile, mother of King Louis IX of France. From a young age, Blanche was married to Louis VIII to secure alliances between France and Castile. Her personal preferences were irrelevant. Her value lay in her ability to unite powerful dynasties and produce heirs. Throughout her life, Blanche demonstrated remarkable intelligence and political acumen, but these qualities were often leveraged to serve the interests of her family and the crown rather than her own desires. Noblewomen like Blanche could wield influence, but only within the confines of roles carefully defined by society around them. This strategic use of noblewomen extended beyond the immediate family to broader societal structures. Marriages were not simply about consolidating power within a single kingdom, they were about creating networks of influence that spanned entire regions, and sometimes even entire continents. Royal and noble families across Europe were interconnected through a web of marital alliances, each connection serving as a potential lever of power. The Church, with its authority to sanctify marriages and enforce religious compliance, became a central figure in ensuring that these networks remained intact and functional. As we consider these dynamics, it is important to reflect on the human cost. Noblewomen, despite their elevated status, often endured lives of confinement, restriction, and obligation. They were raised to serve a purpose larger than themselves, and the consequences of failure or resistance were severe. They were expected to embody virtue, obedience, and piety while navigating the complexities of court politics and family ambition. Their personal agency was limited, and their worth was consistently measured in terms of what they could contribute to the ambitions of others. Yet, despite these restrictions, some noblewomen found ways to exert influence and navigate their constrained worlds. They could serve as advisors, regents, or patrons of art and education, leveraging the power that came with their status in subtle but significant ways. The very fact that they were central to the political and social fabric of medieval Europe meant that even when constrained, their actions could have profound and lasting effects. Their intelligence, resilience, and adaptability became tools through which they could negotiate the terms of their lives within an oppressive system. At this point, one might ask, would you accept being used as a political tool for your family's gain? Could you reconcile your personal desires with the demands of duty, status, and survival in a world where your freedom was secondary to the ambitions of others? These are questions that resonate not only with medieval history, but also with the universal human struggle for autonomy and self-determination.
By examining the lives of noblewomen, we gain insight into the structures of power, the mechanisms of control, and the human stories that lie beneath the surface of history. In summary, noble women in medieval society occupied a paradoxical position. They were immensely valuable as instruments of political strategy, yet their personal freedoms were severely restricted. Their marriages were carefully arranged to secure alliances, consolidate power, and ensure the flow of wealth and property. The Church reinforced these arrangements, providing religious justification and moral authority for what were essentially political transactions. The stories of these women reveal a world where personal choice was subordinate to the demands of family, society, and faith, a world in which their lives were orchestrated like pieces on a chessboard, and their worth was measured not by who they were, but by what they could produce for the ambitions of others. Understanding this context is crucial for appreciating the full extent of the Church's control over noblewomen. It was not merely a matter of personal relationships or family preference. It was a complex, calculated system that intertwined politics, religion, and social hierarchy. The noblewoman's life was a delicate balance between duty and desire, obedience and ambition, survival and influence. And as we delve deeper into the specific ways in which the Church used marriage as a tool of control, the shocking realities of their experiences will become even clearer, revealing a dark and compelling chapter of history that continues to fascinate and disturb to this day.
By the High Middle Ages, the Church was not simply a religious institution, it was the most powerful force in Europe. Kings ruled lands, nobles commanded armies, but the Church governed souls. And in a world where salvation determined eternity, that authority was absolute. To understand how the Church controlled the marriages of noblewomen, we must first understand the scale of its power and how deeply it was woven into medieval politics. The Church crowned kings, legitimized rulers, and declared wars holy or sinful. No monarch ruled without ecclesiastical approval, and no noble family could safely oppose it. Bishops and archbishops were not only spiritual leaders but political actors, often controlling vast estates, armies, and treasuries. The Pope himself stood above kings, capable of excommunicating rulers and plunging entire kingdoms into chaos with a single decree. In this world, defying the Church was not merely rebellion, it was spiritual suicide. Marriage sat at the heart of this power structure. By the 12th century, the Church had successfully claimed exclusive authority over marriage, declaring it a sacred sacrament. This was a crucial transformation. Once marriage became a sacrament, it fell entirely under Church jurisdiction. Families could negotiate alliances, but only the Church could legitimize them. Only the Church could declare a marriage valid, invalid, sinful, or binding for life. This authority gave the Church unprecedented leverage over noble families, especially where women were concerned. Marriage determined inheritance, lineage, legitimacy, and succession. Whoever controlled marriage controlled bloodlines. Whoever controlled bloodlines controlled power. Church law, known as canon law, dictated the rules of marriage. It defined who could marry, when they could marry, and under what conditions a marriage could be dissolved, or more often, not dissolved at all. Divorce, as we understand it today, did not exist. Once a marriage was declared valid, it was indissoluble, regardless of abuse, neglect, or misery. This permanence ensured obedience. A noblewoman could be bound to a man for life, with no legal or religious escape. Consent, in theory, was required. The Church insisted that a marriage was only valid if both parties consented. But in practice, this concept was easily manipulated. Consent could be assumed, coerced, or extracted under pressure. A young girl raised to obey her family, her lord, and her God had little room to refuse. Silence was often interpreted as agreement. Fear was mistaken for consent. Resistance was framed as sin.
The church also controlled marriage through its complex rules on kinship. Canon law forbade marriage between relatives within several degrees of blood relation, a range so broad that nearly all noble families were technically related. This gave the church the power to block or approve marriages at will. If a union suited ecclesiastical or political interests, dispensations could be granted. If it did not, the marriage could be declared incestuous and invalid. This selective enforcement turned marriage law into a weapon. Through this system, arranged marriages became not only common, but inevitable. Noble families understood that securing church approval was essential, and the church understood that noble marriages were opportunities to shape political outcomes. A union between two powerful houses could stabilize a region or threaten ecclesiastical authority. The church ensured it remained the final arbiter. Noblewomen were central to this process because they were the conduits through which alliances flowed. A woman carried lineage, legitimacy, and inheritance into her marriage. By directing where she was placed, the church could influence the balance of power between families, regions, and even kingdoms. Her body became a political instrument, sanctified by religion and sealed with vows she did not choose. Consider the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. As heiress to vast territories, her marriages reshaped European politics. Her first marriage, arranged and sanctioned by the church, made her Queen of France. When that marriage was later annulled, not for Eleanor's happiness, but for political convenience, she was swiftly married again, this time to Henry II of England. Once more, the church officiated, and once more, a woman's marital fate altered the map of Europe. Eleanor's story was exceptional only in scale, not in principle. For less powerful noblewomen, the consequences were often harsher. Many were married in childhood, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, to men decades older. These unions were justified as divinely ordained, framed as necessary for peace, stability, or moral order. A girl who resisted was not seen as brave, but disobedient, not virtuous, but sinful. There are records of young noblewomen being forcibly escorted to churches, surrounded by clergy and family members, and married against their will. Once the vows were spoken, the church declared the marriage binding. Any protest afterward was irrelevant. The sacrament had been completed. The woman's fate was sealed. One such case involved a noblewoman who attempted to flee on the eve of her wedding, seeking refuge in a convent. Her family appealed to the church, which ruled that her attempt to escape did not invalidate the marriage agreement. She was returned, married, and reminded that obedience to her family and husband was obedience to God. The church's ruling left no room for dissent. The church also wielded moral authority to suppress resistance. Sermons emphasized female obedience, chastity, and submission. Women were taught that their suffering was virtuous, that endurance was holy, and that rebellion threatened not only their souls, but the salvation of those around them. Marriage was framed as a woman's divine duty, regardless of the cost. Excommunication was the ultimate threat. A noble family that defied church marriage rulings could be cut off from the sacraments. Churches could be closed, burials denied. Entire regions could be placed under interdict. Few families were willing to risk such consequences for the happiness of a daughter. Under this pressure, resistance collapsed. Even widows were not free. A noblewoman whose husband died often found herself pressured into remarriage, particularly if she controlled valuable lands. The church closely monitored these cases, ensuring that remarriages aligned with political and ecclesiastical interests. A widow who refused could be accused of selfishness, pride, or disobedience to divine will. What makes this system especially disturbing is how thoroughly it was normalized. These practices were not hidden or secret. They were preached from pulpits, written into law, and celebrated as moral order. The suffering of noble women was framed as necessary sacrifice, their obedience as spiritual virtue. Arranged marriages, then, were not merely family decisions, they were instruments of governance. Through marriage, the church could pacify rival houses, redirect inheritance, and shape the future of kingdoms. Noblewomen were the means by which these goals were achieved, their lives molded by doctrine and decree. This control extended beyond individual marriages to entire dynasties. By determining which unions were legitimate, the church decided which children were lawful heirs. Bastardy could strip a lineage of its claim to power. Legitimacy, granted or denied by ecclesiastical authority, could elevate or destroy noble houses. In this way, marriage law became political law. The result was a society in which noble women lived under constant surveillance. Their choices were monitored, their movements restricted, their bodies regulated by religious law. They were praised as symbols of purity and virtue, yet denied the very autonomy that virtue supposedly required. And yet all of this was justified in the name of God. The church presented itself as the guardian of morality, the protector of social order. In reality, it was also an institution deeply invested in maintaining its influence over Europe's ruling class. Marriage was one of its most effective tools. Through it, the church bound families to its authority, secured loyalty, and ensured that no alliance formed without its blessing. As we move forward, the question becomes unavoidable. If marriage was a sacrament and obedience a virtue, where did that leave the women whose lives were sacrificed for power and politics? Were they believers, victims, or both? And what happened when noble women dared to resist a system backed by divine authority? Those answers reveal an even darker layer of this history, one where defiance was punished, silence was enforced, and survival required submission in ways few today can fully imagine.
By the time a noblewoman reached adulthood in medieval Europe, her fate was often already sealed. In many cases, it had been sealed years earlier, sometimes in infancy, sometimes before she was even born. Marriage was not an event that marked the beginning of her adult life. It was a mechanism of control that shaped her entire existence from the very start. One of the most powerful tools the church used was the arrangement of marriages from childhood. Noble families routinely promised their daughters in marriage while they were still children, formalizing these agreements with church approval. These were not symbolic gestures. They were binding contracts, sanctified by religious authority and treated as irreversible obligations. A girl might grow up knowing the name of the man she would one day be forced to marry, long before she understood what marriage even meant. The church justified these arrangements by framing them as morally protective. Early betrothals were said to preserve purity, prevent sin, and maintain social order. In reality, they ensured compliance. A child raised under the certainty of an arranged future had little room to imagine an alternative. Resistance, when it came, was portrayed not as self-preservation, but as moral failure. By adolescence, many noblewomen were married off immediately. Some were barely teenagers. Age gaps of 20, 30, even 40 years were not uncommon. The church sanctioned these unions without hesitation, insisting that once a girl reached what it considered the age of consent, her marriage was lawful, sacred, and permanent. Any discomfort or fear she experienced was irrelevant. The sacrament had been fulfilled. But what happened when a noblewoman resisted? This is where the church's power became truly terrifying. One of its most effective weapons was the threat of excommunication. To modern ears, this may sound abstract, but in medieval society, excommunication was a living nightmare. It meant exclusion from the sacraments, from community, from spiritual protection. An excommunicated person was believed to be cut off from God himself. For a noblewoman, this punishment did not stop with her. Her family could be shunned, her household isolated, her lineage stained. Faced with this threat, families often became enforcers of church will.
Fathers, brothers, and uncles pressured daughters into obedience, not necessarily out of cruelty, but fear. Fear of spiritual damnation, fear of political ruin, fear of standing alone against an institution that claimed divine authority. Some noblewomen attempted to escape marriage by fleeing to convents, believing that religious life might protect them. At times, this worked, but more often, the church intervened. If a woman had already been promised in marriage, her vows to God were deemed secondary to her obligations to her family and future husband. She could be removed from the convent and forced into marriage, her attempt to escape framed as disobedience rather than devotion. One noblewoman, whose story survives in fragmented records, sought sanctuary after learning she would be married to a man known for cruelty. She refused to speak her vows, standing silent at the altar. The church ruled that her silence did not invalidate the ceremony. The marriage was declared binding. She was handed over to her husband that same day. Her resistance, recorded briefly and coldly, ended there. Another mechanism of control was social isolation. A woman who resisted marriage could be labeled unstable, sinful, or dangerous. Rumors spread quickly in noble courts. A reputation for disobedience could destroy a woman's standing permanently. Even if she avoided marriage, she might find herself isolated, unsupported, and vulnerable in a society where survival depended on family alliances. The church reinforced this isolation through doctrine. Sermons warned against female independence. Obedience was praised as the highest virtue. Submission was framed as God's will. A woman who challenged her assigned role was portrayed as a threat not only to herself, but to the moral fabric of society. In this environment, resistance required extraordinary courage and often led to devastating consequences. Religious justification was the final and most insidious tool. The church taught that marriage was ordained by God, that a woman's suffering within it was sanctified, and that endurance brought spiritual reward. A noblewoman's personal choice was dismissed as selfish desire, while obedience was elevated to holiness. This theology stripped women of moral authority over their own lives. Even abuse did not dissolve marriage. A woman beaten, neglected, or imprisoned by her husband had no legal or religious recourse. The church urged patience, prayer, and submission. To leave was to sin. To complain was to undermine sacred order. In this way, marriage became not a union, but a life sentence. And yet, some women still resisted. One noblewoman dared to defy the church openly. She refused her arranged marriage repeatedly, appealing to clerics, relatives, and even the bishop overseeing her region. When persuasion failed, she was confined by her family. When confinement failed, the church intervened. She was declared disobedient, spiritually dangerous, and placed under religious discipline. Her property was seized, her autonomy erased. The message was clear: defiance would not be tolerated. What happened next shocked even the most powerful nobles. Rather than forcing the marriage quietly, the church made an example of her. Her case was publicized, her resistance condemned in sermons, her name associated with sin and chaos. Other noblewomen watched closely. The lesson was unmistakable. Compliance meant survival, resistance meant destruction. Tragic consequences followed many such stories. Some women vanished from records entirely, likely confined to unwanted marriages or religious houses against their will. Others died young, worn down by childbirth, neglect, or despair. A few became symbols of warning, their stories told in whispers to daughters and nieces, as reminders of what happened to those who refused. Marriage under this system was not a personal milestone, it was a tool of governance. Through it, the church disciplined noble families, controlled inheritance, and reinforced social hierarchy. Women were its primary instruments because their bodies carried legitimacy, heirs, and continuity. Control the woman, and you control the future. What makes this history so unsettling is how systematically it was enforced. There was no single villain, no isolated cruelty. The system was supported by law, faith, family, and fear. Each element reinforced the others, creating a cage so complete that escape was nearly impossible. And yet the church continued to frame itself as protector of morality, protector of order, protector of women themselves. The contradiction was never acknowledged. A woman forced into marriage was told she was being safeguarded. A girl stripped of choice was told she was being guided. Suffering was renamed virtue. As we move forward, the question becomes impossible to ignore. How many lives were broken to maintain this system? How many voices were silenced in the name of God and stability? And what happened when marriage, intended as a secret bond, became one of the most effective instruments of control in medieval Europe? The answers lie in the stories that follow, stories of women whose lives reveal the true cost of power when faith and politics merge, and whose experiences expose a darker truth behind one of history's most revered institutions.
To truly understand how deeply the church controlled noblewomen through marriage, we must look beyond laws and doctrine and examine real lives. These were not abstract systems operating in isolation. They were applied to human beings, young women whose marriages reshaped kingdoms, fueled wars, and altered the course of history. Each of these stories reveals a different layer of control, and together they expose a system designed to dominate through marriage. One of the most striking examples is Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful heiresses in medieval Europe. Born into immense privilege, Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, a territory larger than the royal domain of France itself. Her value was extraordinary, not because of who she was, but because of what she owned. The church-approved marriage that followed was less a union and more a political transaction. Eleanor was married at a young age to Louis VII of France, instantly transforming her into Queen of France. The church sanctioned the marriage, binding Eleanor's vast lands to the French crown. Yet the union was deeply unhappy. When the marriage produced no male heir, the church intervened once again. Using claims of consanguinity, blood relation, it annulled the marriage. This annulment was not about Eleanor's welfare, it was about political convenience. Within weeks, Eleanor remarried Henry II of England, again with church approval, transferring her lands to a rival crown and igniting centuries of conflict between France and England. Eleanor's marriages demonstrate how the church used women as conduits of power, redirecting territories and shaping empires through sacred vows. Another case reveals the cost of resistance. Margaret of Scotland, later Queen of Norway, was married as a child to secure political stability between kingdoms. Like many noblewomen, she had no voice in the arrangement. When she later attempted to assert independence in her role, she encountered resistance not only from nobles, but from church authorities who expected obedience and submission. Her marriage was used to legitimize claims and prevent rebellion, and her personal desires vanished beneath the weight of political necessity. Her life illustrates how even queens were constrained by the system, bound by marriages they did not choose and roles they could not escape. Then there's the story of Eloise, whose life stands as one of the most tragic examples of love crushed by religious authority. Eloise was not a queen or an heiress, but she was connected to noble circles and deeply affected by church control over marriage. Her relationship with the scholar Peter Abelard was passionate and intellectual, but it defied social and religious norms. When Eloise became pregnant, the church's response was swift and unforgiving. Marriage was imposed not to protect her, but to restore moral order. When Abelard was later attacked and mutilated, Eloise was forced into a convent against her will. Her resistance was spiritual and intellectual, but the outcome was the same: separation, confinement, and silence. Her story reveals how the church used marriage and religious life interchangeably to control women who deviated from acceptable paths. Political upheaval often followed marriages arranged under church authority. Consider Isabella of Angoulême, married at the age of 12 to King John of England. Her marriage was not a union of affection, but a strategic move to secure territory in France. The church approved the marriage, despite Isabella already being promised to another noble. This decision enraged powerful French families and contributed directly to political instability, rebellions, and war. Isabella's forced marriage demonstrate how church-sanctioned unions could destabilize entire regions, proving that these marriages were not about peace or morality, but strategic advantage.
Another powerful example is Margaret of Anjou, whose marriage to Henry VI of England was orchestrated to end conflict between England and France. The Church presented the union as a sacred step toward peace. Instead, it became one of the most politically explosive marriages of the 15th century. Margaret, young and isolated, was thrust into a hostile court. As Henry's mental health deteriorated, Margaret was forced into a political role she never sought. Her marriage became a catalyst for the Wars of the Roses, plunging England into decades of bloodshed. Once again, a noblewoman's marriage, sanctified by the Church, reshaped history at enormous human cost. Each of these cases follows a recognizable pattern. A woman of noble birth is identified as politically valuable, her marriage is arranged with church approval, her consent is assumed or coerced. The union produces political consequences that benefit institutions of power. Her personal welfare is secondary, if it's considered at all. What ties these stories together is not cruelty alone, but structure. The Church didn't need to act violently in every case. Its authority was so deeply embedded that compliance often came automatically. Families internalized church expectations. Women were raised to obey them. Resistance, when it occurred, was isolated and punished. These marriages also reveal the Church's flexibility when power was at stake. Rules on kinship, consent, and sacrament were enforced or relaxed depending on political need. A marriage could be declared sacred and unbreakable one year and invalid the next. This inconsistency was not accidental. It allowed the Church to remain the ultimate decision-maker. Perhaps most disturbing is how often noblewomen disappeared from the historical record once their political usefulness faded. After serving their purpose, producing heirs, transferring land, securing alliances, they were sidelined, confined, or forgotten. Their lives became footnotes to the stories of men and institutions. And yet, through these fragmented records, a pattern emerges. Marriage was never neutral. It was never simply a family matter. It was a strategic instrument wielded by the Church to shape society, control power, and maintain dominance over the ruling class. These women lived lives of contradiction. They were elevated in status, yet denied autonomy, celebrated in ceremony, yet silenced in practice. Their weddings were grand spectacles, but the vows they spoke often sealed their loss of freedom rather than their fulfillment. As we examine these case studies, a troubling question remains. If even queens and heiresses could not escape this system, what chance did any noblewoman have? And if marriage could ignite wars, topple dynasties, and reshape nations, who was it really serving? The answers become clearer as we move deeper into the consequences of this control, consequences that extended far beyond individual lives and into the very fabric of medieval society.
By the time the marriage vows were spoken, the consequences for noblewomen were only just beginning. What followed was not merely a change in household or title, but a profound and often irreversible transformation of their inner lives, their family dynamics, and the political landscape around them. Marriage, as enforced by the Church, left scars that reached far beyond the individual woman, shaping societies and kingdoms for generations. For many noblewomen, the most immediate consequence was the complete loss of autonomy. Once married, a woman's legal and social identity was absorbed into that of her husband. Her body, her labor, and her reproductive capacity were no longer her own. Decisions about where she lived, whom she saw, and how she lived were made on her behalf. Even her correspondence could be monitored. Her role was narrowly defined: obedience, childbirth, and silence. This loss of control carried deep emotional consequences. Historical records rarely describe feelings openly, but glimpses appear in letters, chronicles, and monastic writings. Women wrote of loneliness, fear, and resignation. Some expressed devotion to duty, convincing themselves that suffering was virtuous. Others showed signs of despair, retreating into silence or religious devotion as the only acceptable outlet for grief. Emotional trauma was normalized, framed as part of a woman's sacred obligation. For those trapped in abusive or neglectful marriages, the situation was even severe. The Church offered no meaningful escape. Marriage was indissoluble, suffering was sanctified, and endurance was praised. A woman who spoke out risked social disgrace or spiritual condemnation.
Over time, many learned to suppress their inner lives entirely, presenting an image of piety while carrying unseen wounds. The consequences extended outward into families. Marriages arranged for political gain often sowed seeds of resentment and rivalry. A noblewoman forced into an alliance could become a focal point for conflict between families, especially if expectations were not met. Failure to produce a male heir could lead to blame, humiliation, or abandonment. In-laws might view her as a liability rather than an asset, intensifying emotional isolation. Family rivalries also escalated when marriages failed to deliver political stability. Alliances forged through marriage were fragile, dependent on ongoing cooperation. When trust broke down, former allies became enemies. Noblewomen, positioned at the center of these alliances, often bore the consequences. They could be accused of disloyalty, suspected of espionage, or punished for conflicts they had no role in creating. These personal and familial tensions frequently spilled over into broader political conflicts. A single marriage could alter claims to land, titles, and succession, triggering disputes that lasted decades. Children born from these unions became symbols of legitimacy or contention. Their right to rule could be challenged, defended, or revoked, depending on how the marriage was later interpreted by the church. Succession crises were among the most devastating long-term consequences. When a marriage failed to produce a clear heir, or when the legitimacy of children was questioned, entire kingdoms could descend into chaos. The church's authority to declare marriages valid or invalid meant it could retroactively determine whether a ruler had the right to govern. This power made marriage not just a private matter, but a cornerstone of political stability or instability. History offers countless examples of wars sparked by disputed succession. Claims based on maternal lineage, marital legitimacy, or annulled unions fueled conflicts that reshaped borders and destroyed dynasties. In these struggles, the original noblewoman often vanished from the narrative, remembered only as a link in a chain of power. Yet without her marriage, the conflict would not have existed at all. This raises a deeply unsettling question. Could a single marriage really change the fate of entire kingdoms? Time and again, the answer is yes. Through one church-sanctioned union, land could shift hands, alliances could collapse, and wars could erupt. What appeared as a sacred ritual was often the first move in a political game whose consequences were measured in blood and suffering. The societal impact was equally profound. These practices reinforced rigid gender roles and normalized the suppression of women's autonomy. Noblewomen were presented as moral exemplars, yet denied moral agency. Their obedience was celebrated while their silence was demanded. This contradiction shaped cultural attitudes toward women for centuries, embedding inequality into the very foundations of European society. At the same time, the Church's role in marriage strengthened its grip on power. By positioning itself as the guardian of legitimacy and morality, it ensured that no ruler or noble family could operate independently. Marriage became a leash, binding the elite to ecclesiastical authority through fear, obligation, and ritual. The emotional suffering of individual women was an acceptable cost in the pursuit of order and control. And yet, within this system, traces of resilience remain. Some noblewomen found ways to influence politics indirectly, advising sons, managing estates, or acting as regents. Others turned to religion not as submission, but as refuge. Their strength was often quiet, constrained by circumstance, but no less real. Still, these exceptions do not erase the broader reality of systemic control. As we reflect on these consequences, it becomes clear that the Church's control of marriage was not merely about enforcing morality, it was about shaping society itself. Through the regulation of noble women's lives, it dictated the flow of power, the legitimacy of rulers, and the direction of history. The emotional pain, family rivalries, and political upheaval were not unintended side effects. They were integral to a system that prioritized stability over humanity and authority over compassion. Noble women paid the price, their lives molded by forces that treated them as instruments rather than individuals. And as we move toward the final reflection, one question lingers above all others. If power could be built on the forced silence of women, what does that reveal about the foundations of medieval society, and how much of that legacy still shapes the world today?
To understand why the medieval church maintained such tight control over marriage, especially the marriages of noblewomen, we must look beyond individual cruelty or isolated abuses. What emerges instead is a system built on preservation of power, hierarchy, and authority. Marriage was not merely a social institution, it was one of the church's most effective tools for maintaining dominance in a fragile and deeply unequal world. At its core, the church's control over marriage was about stability. Medieval Europe was a volatile landscape of shifting borders, rival dynasties, and constant conflict. Kings rose and fell, noble houses collapsed, and alliances changed with alarming speed. In such an environment, the church positioned itself as the one constant force, the guardian of order in a chaotic world. By controlling marriage, it controlled legitimacy, inheritance, and succession, the foundations of political stability. Noble women sat at the center of this system because they were the carriers of continuity. Through them passed bloodlines, property, and claims to power. A marriage validated by the church could secure peace, while one denied could unravel an entire dynasty. By regulating who noble women could marry, the church ensured that no major transfer of power occurred without its approval. This was not incidental, it was strategic. Gender ideology played a crucial role in sustaining this control. Medieval religious teaching emphasized female obedience as a moral ideal. Women were portrayed as morally weaker, more susceptible to sin, and in need of guidance. These beliefs were reinforced through sermons, texts, and laws that framed male authority as natural and divinely sanctioned. Within this worldview, a woman's lack of autonomy was not seen as injustice, but protection, both for her soul and for society at large. Marriage became the mechanism through which these ideas were enforced. A woman under the authority of her husband was considered properly ordered. Her obedience was equated with virtue, her silence with piety. Any challenge to the structure threatened not only family hierarchy, but religious doctrine itself. By suppressing female autonomy, the church reinforced a gendered power imbalance that benefited both ecclesiastical and secular elites. Religion added an unassailable layer to this system. Because marriage was defined as a sacrament, opposition became heresy. To question an arranged marriage was to question God's will. This framing eliminated moral debate. Suffering was sanctified, endurance glorified, and injustice reframed as divine testing. In this way, the church transformed social control into spiritual duty. Power dynamics between the church and the nobility further explain why this system endured. While kings and lords wielded military force, the church controlled legitimacy. A ruler without ecclesiastical approval was vulnerable, his authority always in question. By inserting itself into marriage and family life, the church ensured that even the most powerful nobles remained dependent on its blessing. Noble women, as the linchpins of alliance and succession, became the leverage point through which this dependence was enforced. It is important to recognize that this system persisted not only because of coercion, but because it was normalized. Generations were raised within it. Families internalized its values. Women were taught from childhood to accept sacrifice as destiny. Men were taught to view control as responsibility. The system sustained itself through belief as much as force. Yet within this structure, cracks appeared. Noble women who resisted, even briefly, exposed its fragility. Their resistance revealed that control required constant reinforcement through law, doctrine, and punishment. The harsh consequences faced by these women were not just deterrents, they were reminders that obedience was essential to maintaining order. When we reflect on this history from a modern perspective, the emotional distance collapses. While the structures have changed, the underlying questions remain familiar. Who controls personal choices? How are power and morality used to justify inequality? Where does authority end and autonomy begin? Today, marriage is often framed as a personal decision, rooted in consent and mutual respect. But echoes of the past linger in debates over reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, and gender roles.
Institutions, religious, political, and cultural, still exert influence over private lives, often in ways that mirror medieval dynamics. Control may no longer be enforced through excommunication, but social pressure, legal constraints, and moral judgment continue to shape choices. The story of medieval noblewomen reminds us that autonomy is rarely granted freely. It is negotiated, contested, and sometimes denied outright. Their lives challenge us to question systems that prioritize order over humanity, stability over freedom. They force us to confront the cost of power when it is built on silence and sacrifice. These women were not merely victims of their time. They were individuals navigating an oppressive structure with limited options. Their endurance, their quiet resistance, and their survival deserve recognition. By examining their experiences, we gain insight not only into medieval history, but into the enduring relationship between power and control. As we reach the end of this journey, one truth stands out. The Church's control over marriage was not an accident of faith, but a deliberate strategy woven into the fabric of society. It shaped nations, defined gender roles, and left a legacy that still influences how we think about authority and autonomy today. Understanding this history does not diminish the spiritual significance many associate with religion. Instead, it deepens our awareness of how belief can be used, both to guide and to dominate. It reminds us that institutions are shaped by human choices, and those choices have consequences that echo across centuries. The lives of medieval noblewomen ask us to listen carefully to voices long silenced, and to consider how power operates in our own time. Because history is not only about the past, it is about the patterns we inherit, the systems we accept, and the future we choose to build.
As we come to the end of this story, one truth stands unmistakably clear. For medieval noblewomen, marriage was rarely a choice, it was a strategy, a transaction, a carefully controlled mechanism through which power was preserved, transferred, and enforced. These women were not merely daughters, wives, or queens, they were political pawns. From childhood, their lives were shaped by lineage, inheritance, and ambition. Their value was measured in land, alliances, and heirs. Love, preference, and personal desire were luxuries they could not afford. Their bodies carried bloodlines, their marriages carried consequences that reached far beyond their own lives. At the center of this system stood the Church. By declaring marriage a sacred sacrament, it claimed ultimate authority over who could marry, when they could marry, and whether those marriages could ever be undone. Through canon law, moral doctrine, and spiritual fear, the Church orchestrated unions that reshaped families, kingdoms, and history itself. It did not merely bless marriages, it controlled them. This control was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply embedded in medieval society. By regulating marriage, the Church controlled inheritance. By controlling inheritance, it controlled succession. And by controlling succession, it ensured that no ruler, no noble house, and no alliance could exist without its approval. Noblewomen became the linchpin of this system, the point at which faith, power, and politics converged. The consequences were devastating and enduring. On a personal level, noblewomen lost autonomy, endured emotional trauma, and lived lives defined by obligation rather than choice. Their suffering was normalized, reframed as virtue, and sanctified as obedience. Many vanished into unwanted marriages, religious confinement, or historical silence, remembered only for the power they transferred, not the lives they lived. On a societal level, these marriages fueled rivalries, ignited wars, and destabilized entire regions. Disputed successions, annulments, and church-sanctioned unions altered the fate of nations. A single marriage could redraw borders, topple dynasties, and plunge kingdoms into decades of conflict. What appeared as a sacred vow often became the first move in a long and bloody political struggle. And yet, for centuries, this system endured, not because it was just, but because it was effective. It maintained order in a violent world. It reinforced hierarchy. It concentrated authority in the hands of institutions that claimed divine legitimacy.
Noblewomen paid the price so that power could remain predictable and controllable. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable questions. How easily can morality be shaped to serve authority? How often is stability valued over humanity? And how many lives have been sacrificed in the name of order, faith, and tradition? These questions do not belong only to the past. While the world has changed, the dynamics of control have not disappeared. Power still seeks to regulate bodies, choices, and futures. Institutions still frame authority as moral necessity, and autonomy, especially for women, remains contested in many parts of the world. The experiences of medieval noblewomen remind us that control rarely announces itself as oppression. More often, it presents itself as protection, duty, or divine will. So now, the story turns to you. What would you have done if your entire future were decided before you could speak? If your marriage, your home, and your destiny were chosen by strangers claiming to act in your best interest? Would you have obeyed to survive? Would you have resisted and risked everything? Or would you have tried to carve out meaning within a system designed to deny you choice? These are not hypothetical questions. They were lived realities for countless women whose voices history nearly erased. If this story changed the way you see medieval history, power, or marriage, let that reflection continue. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have complied, resisted, or found another way? Your perspective adds to this conversation, and history is richer when more voices are heard. If you found this exploration insightful, unsettling, or eye-opening, support the channel by liking this video. It helps bring more hidden histories like this to the surface. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the darker corners of history, stories that challenge comfortable narratives and reveal the human cost behind institutions we often take for granted. And consider sharing this video with someone who enjoys history that goes beyond dates and battles, history that asks difficult questions and confronts uncomfortable truths. Because history is not just about what happened, it is about what we choose to remember, what we choose to question, and what we refuse to repeat.